She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and walked to the front door, as she did every morning. But this time, the wood creaked louder than usual, as if to warn her that something was out of place. Margaret O'Connor, 86, bent down with difficulty and saw the marks. Deep boots, fresh mud. On the doorframe, a crumpled piece of paper trembled in the wind. Sell while you can. Her heart raced, but she didn't let it show. Her eyes had already seen war, mourning, abandonment. What else could they take from her? Yet that night, she hid a knife under her pillow. Have you ever felt something bad happen? Stay with me. Because what was coming, no one, not even her, could have imagined. That morning, Margaret did not sleep a wink. Every creak in the old house seemed like a whisper from the past. Every shadow in the woods seemed like a figure approaching. She held her husband's old radio with trembling hands, as if it were a last connection to some invisible protection. The smell of coffee cooling on the table no longer brought comfort, only memories. Of her husband's laughter on that same porch, of her grandsons rocking on summer days, of the time when it was not necessary to sleep in fear. She didn't tell anyone. Not her neighbors, not her church pastor, not even Evan. She kept it all to herself, like someone who keeps an old pain, the kind that we learn to carry in silence. But what she didn't know is that her silence was about to be broken in the most brutal way. If this type of story touches you, if you have ever felt fear where there should be peace, share here in the comments what moved you the most. It is by reading these messages that we understand that we are not alone, that there is a bond between those who live, those who feel, and those who watch. Like the video if you want to see more stories like this, and subscribe to the channel to walk with us through these narratives that the world tends to forget, but that still live on in the details. Your participation here helps this channel to continue existing and to carry these voices forward. And it was there, in the silence before daybreak, that something began to move. Not in the woods, but in the heart of someone who had already survived a lot, and still had the strength to resist one more. 3:20 in the morning. The sound of something sliding across the window echoed inside the house like a sharp whisper. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, in absolute silence, trying to distinguish whether it was just the wind or something else. But deep down, she already knew. This was no longer an ordinary night in the country. Through the crack in the yellowish lace curtain, she saw figures moving quickly in the darkness. One of them was leaning his forehead against the kitchen glass as if he could see through. Another was kicking violently at the boards on the side wall, shaking the pictures that still held the smiles of youth. Margaret held the old radio in both hands. It was heavy and creaked when she pressed the emergency button. Evan had insisted on installing it, but she wasn't sure if she should use it. She felt ashamed, as if speaking out about what was happening would be an admission of weakness, even as her heart pounded and the air rushed from her lungs. Outside, the metallic sound of pliers biting into the fence wire made her shiver. She knew the sound. Her husband, when he was a young farmer, had used the same tool. Only now, the same sound carried threat, not work. And it was this difference, subtle and cruel, that pressed against her chest like a hot iron. In the room, the walls seemed thinner. The flashlight flickered with a low battery, as if it were afraid too. Margaret was not one to pray, but at that moment, she closed her eyes and tried to remember her husband's face. The smell of hay in his hair. The way he always told her she was stronger than she thought. She wanted to believe that. Meanwhile, more than 300 kilometers away, Evan slept on a shallow mat in a makeshift training barracks. His beard was unkempt, his arms stretched out over his backpack, his breathing finally calm after days of exhaustion. But the peace was short-lived. The sharp beep went off on his phone at 3:27 a.m. The sound pierced the silence of the room like a siren. Within seconds, Evan was on his feet, his eyes still blurry. He grabbed his phone with his left hand and opened the camera app. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 figures surrounded the farm. One of them had already crossed the garden. The night camera showed the fence cut. Another was crouched near the shed. The third was trying to force open the kitchen window, using some tool. But it was the fourth detail that most paralyzed him. The dim light of Margaret's flashlight flickering inside the house. Evan knew what that meant. He knew his grandmother. If the light was flickering, it was because she was trying to hide her fear. And if she hadn't pressed the radio button yet, it was because she believed she could handle it herself. Like she always had. Like she always tried. But this time, it was different. He pulled on his coat, which still smelled of oil and metal, slipped on his boots in silence, and grabbed his rapid response kit. Every piece had its place. The knife in the side pocket, the restraining lever in the backpack, the telescopic baton tied with military tape. It all felt like a ritual, but every gesture was driven by something much stronger than training. It was desperation. With every passing second, Evan's stomach churned. The camera was in real time, but the distance between him and his grandmother seemed infinite. He tried calling the county sheriff. 3 rings. 4. When he answered, the voice came out slurred and impatient. "No hard evidence, son. I can't send a patrol car for a shadow." And he hung up. The sound of the cut-off call echoed in the empty room, like a sentence. Margaret, still locked inside the house, could feel her hands tingling. The radio was heavy in her lap, but it was her only bridge to the outside world. Outside, the men began to shout. They mocked her age. They said they would get in any way they could. One of them began to bang something made of iron on the door. Each knock made the wood tremble and the window panes rattle. The house seemed to breathe in pain. She didn't scream, but inside her chest, everything was begging for help. Evan started the engine of the tactical jeep, an old vehicle he had adapted himself with spare parts from past missions. The lights came on like angry eyes in the early morning. The roar of the engine broke the silence of the base. With his eyes fixed on the dirt road ahead, he knew either he had to make it in time, or he would never forgive himself. And it was there, in the contrast between abandonment and response, between the grandmother's silence and the grandson's fury, that the true transformation began. It wasn't just about defending someone. It was about rescuing a story that had never been told, protecting a legacy that the town had already forgotten. Margaret wasn't just an old woman in an old house. She was the root of everything Evan had learned about courage, and now it was being tested in a way that not even the battlefield could prepare him for. Comment here. She was not alone, if that made sense to you. Because sometimes, what sustains someone in the most difficult moment is knowing that on the other side, someone is listening. And even without knowing what awaited her in the next few hours, Margaret pressed the radio button. Finally. Because deep down, she knew courage may be silent, but it is never blind. The sound of the boards bending under the weight of unfamiliar footsteps made Margaret hold her breath. The house, which had been a shelter for decades, now seemed like a wooden trap about to give way. She crawled behind the living room table, protected only by the air of a past that no longer protected anyone. The flashlight flickered, casting flickering shadows on the walls that had once held family photos, festive dinners, and the laughter of people who had never returned. Sitting on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, Margaret held the radio as if she were holding a picture of someone she loves. The emergency button had finally been pressed, but the silence continued to scream. Outside, the men were cursing and mocking the stubborn old woman who didn't know when to leave. One of them kicked the door so hard that the bookshelf next to the room fell over, scattering old books and a framed photo of her husband as a young man in uniform. The sound of breaking glass brought back an immediate memory. Margaret found herself in her early 20s, sitting on the porch, listening to Louis Armstrong play on a battery-powered radio, while her husband dug the ground to plant the first seeds. There had been the orchard. There had been the birth of their life together. There, on that very land that was now being threatened by people who knew nothing. People who saw only cheap soil, and not the ashes of what had been a lifetime of love. She stood up slowly, even though her bones ached, and pushed the table a few inches away to block the inner door to the kitchen. The radio crackled again. It was Evan, but there was no voice. Only static. Margaret looked up. The sound on the roof told her that one of the invaders was trying to get in through the attic. The footsteps weighed heavily like an omen. This place had withstood hurricanes, droughts, deaths, even the pain of losing a child. But tonight, perhaps it could not withstand the world's neglect. Meanwhile, Evan trudged along the dirt road, the Jeep vibrating beneath his feet. The headlights cut through the darkness like daggers. Every curve reminded him of a training session, every tree an obstacle he had overcome in the past. But nothing compared to what he felt now. It was more than fear. It was urgency. He knew that if he arrived even 5 minutes late, he might find his grandmother lying on the ground, his farm violated, and a part of him, the most precious part, gone irretrievably. The images on his phone flickered with the unstable connection in the countryside. But they still showed figures moving, shadows crossing the porch. On one of the cameras, Evan saw something that made him gasp for a second. A knife in the hand of one of the men, and Margaret's flashlight lying on the floor of the living room. The beam of light was pointing straight at the shattered window. He pressed down harder on the accelerator. He was less than 20 kilometers away. Every second now felt like a sentence. Inside the house, Margaret bent down and picked up the kitchen knife she had left beside the stove. The blade was short, dull, but heavy. She held it not as a weapon, but as a reminder that she was still alive, that even with her shaking hands and tired knees, she was still her own person. But the doubt gnawed at her. For how much longer? She heard a cracking sound from the roof, then the sound of the woodwork giving way. Dust fell from the ceiling. The sound of something heavy rolling over the house sounded like thunder on a dry day. And then silence. A silence so absolute that the sound of her own heartbeat seemed deafening. Evan rounded the last corner. The property appeared between the trees, lit only by moonlight. The gate was open. The fence was broken. And on the ground were fresh footprints. He turned off the headlights before approaching, keeping the engine low and low. When he parked the Jeep, he grabbed the restraining stick and climbed out quietly. The training was part of his body, but instinct was guiding him now. He walked around the back of the house, stepping precisely through the tall grass. He knew exactly where the sensors were. He had programmed them himself. And when he saw one of them go off silently, indicating movement near the shed, he took a deep breath. Someone was there. Someone who had no idea what it meant to threaten the woman who had raised him with stories of honor, discipline, and truth. As he stood near the side of the house, Evan heard a muffled scream coming from inside. His grandmother's voice, weak but firm. He had no more doubts. He ran silently to the back door, saw the shadow of one of the attackers trying to force the inside handle. In one swift movement, he threw the lever and knocked him down with a sharp blow to the shoulder. The man fell to his side, groaning. Evan reached down, grabbed the back of his neck, and said, almost in a whisper, "You just picked the wrong place, on the wrong night, with the wrong woman." Comment here. She was the root. Yes, because when everything seems about to fall, it is at the root that strength is revealed. And there's something even more powerful about to happen. Because not everyone there was ready for what was coming next. Evan was still holding the phone in his hand when he heard the click of the connection being terminated. The sharp sound cut deeper than the sheriff's indifferent response. This wasn't just a denial. It was an official, institutional abandonment of the very person they were supposed to protect. A cruel reminder that to the system, his grandmother was just another old woman isolated in the middle of nowhere. No one would come. No one would come. Jaw clenched, he closed his eyes for 2 seconds. In the mental darkness that formed there, he saw his grandmother's face. He remembered the last time he had been on this farm, her serving him coffee and cornbread, as if he were still the boy who played in the barnyard. But inside, Evan already bore the scars of a life of combat, and now they hurt in a new way. This was no longer a mission. It was personal. It was about rescue, about justice. He ran to the base's makeshift storage room, unlocked the lock with a sharp shove, and grabbed his full kit. his hurried footsteps echoed on the cement floor. He put on his light vest, his reinforced boots, and his tactical backpack with minimal supplies. Everything had to fit in the next few hours, because he knew he wouldn't have time to repack anything. The journey would require precision, but most of all, a fear-proof mindset. He couldn't hesitate. Not once. The Jeep roared away. Evan traced the route in his mind like a life-saving map. The paved road gave way to dirt trails lined with tall grass and ancient streetlights. It was like going back in time, but now with a clock ticking inside his chest. Where she stood, Margaret could barely keep her eyes fixed on one spot. The noise on the roof grew louder. Someone, or something, was walking across the tiles, each slat creaking with the weight of the threat. She glanced towards the living room window, saw a quick figure, a shadow cast by the dim moonlight. Then a crack. The back window had been broken. His body reacted instinctively. He picked up the fallen lantern, even though the light was failing, and dragged himself to the room. He locked the door from the inside and pushed an old trunk against it. The sound of the trunk scraping against the floor was the only noise he could manage. The rest was pure chaos. Inside the room, she huddled beside the bed. A photograph of her husband, stained by time, rested on the bedside table. Margaret picked it up with trembling hands, as if holding the only proof that she had once been loved, protected. And there, in that simple gesture, was a silent pain. The pain of someone who sees everything she has built being threatened. Not by the force of a storm, but by the indifference of the world. Evan was now crossing the narrowest part of the road. The Jeep's tires slid on the loose rocks. The headlights shook. But he kept his eyes on his phone's screen, where the camera footage showed glimpses of the interior of the house. One in particular made his stomach turn. A figure in the hallway outside the bedroom door. He screamed. He screamed in the car, alone, as if anger could make its way faster. The pain of helplessness was sharp, cutting. Because he didn't know if he still had time, or if what he would find would be the wreckage of a story he had sworn to protect. Margaret heard the doorknob being forced, then punches. Someone outside was saying incoherent, offensive phrases. They were trying to knock her down out of fear, but she didn't respond. She just held the kitchen knife tightly, as if the blunt blade still had power. It was the symbol of her resistance. On the opposite side of the house, the second intruder was looking for an alternative entrance. He passed by the back porch, saw the door ajar, and entered silently. He did not know that on the other side, the earth held more than roots. It held traps. Evan had prepared this for weeks before. Heat sensors, fake wooden signs, ground trackers. It was all there. A sensor buzzed on his phone. Someone was stepping on marked ground. He stopped the car 200 yards from the entrance and turned off the engine. He grabbed the crowbar and the stick. The wind blew with the smell of wet earth and pent-up tension. The walk to the house was made without a single sound. He knew the way. Every stone, every step, every inch of the fence. He knelt behind the shed and saw the shadow of one of the men trying to break down the entrance to the living room. Evan stood up, approached from behind, and, in one swift movement, wrapped the baton around the invader's neck. The man tried to scream, but was restrained before the sound could come out. He fell with his eyes wide open, not understanding where the blow had come from. The second man, the one on the roof, heard the crash and jumped to the ground. But his fall was awkward. He tripped over the wires of a makeshift trap and fell to the ground, catching his leg in a loop of rope. Evan ran to him and pinned him in 2 movements. The man was screaming, cursing, spitting, but his eyes were full of terror. Inside the room, Margaret listened to the sounds without knowing what they meant. Blows, bodies falling, muffled moans. She wasn't sure if it was the end or the beginning of something new. For a moment, she thought about unlocking the door, but fear still overcame hope. And then everything went silent. A heavy, dense silence, as if time had stopped. Margaret pressed her ear against the wood of the door. No sound, no footsteps, no shouts, no threats. The radio crackled once. Then a deep, low voice that she would recognize even at the end of the world. "Grandma, everything is fine now." Comment here. She resisted until the end. Because there are stories that deserve to be remembered, and others that need to be told down to the last detail, and the most unexpected was yet to happen. The first light of dawn was still hidden behind the hill, when the sound of the engine cut through the darkness like a blade. Margaret, locked inside the small bathroom, with peeling tiles and the smell of old soap, heard the noise approaching, and felt something strange, a mixture of hope and distrust. She clutched the radio to her chest as if it were a reliquary, a fragile bridge between fear and faith. On the other side of the door, she could still hear hurried footsteps, loose shouts, threats that seemed to lose strength, as that sound, the deep rumble of the Jeep, became more present. Outside, the dust rose like a curtain. Evan got out of the Jeep while it was still moving. The tires had barely stopped spinning when he stepped on the ground and ran with the lever in his hand, steady, silent, precise. The first intruder didn't even have time to react. He was in the shed, fiddling with the wooden tools, trying to find something that would make the break-in easier. The blow came hard, in the back. The man fell to the ground with a low grunt. Evan tied him up with nylon tape, gagged him, and dragged him to the central pillar of the barn. There was no room for hesitation. The second tried to escape through the back of the property. He had heard the engine, the thud, the sound of boots on the gravel, and he ran. But he forgot about the sensor. A thin, almost invisible wire triggered the trap that Evan had set weeks before. A net that, pulled by tension, wrapped around his legs like a snake. He fell face down to the ground, scraping his face and screaming. Evan approached silently. The intruder looked at him in fear, kicking on the ground. Evan said nothing. He simply tied the man's wrists with plastic cable ties and dragged him to the shade of a tree. The third, however, was still on the porch, facing the house's door. He was looking at the doorknob, breathing heavily, as if he wanted to convince himself to break in. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected an old woman to have the strength to hold anything. Maybe he was just having fun with the power to scare an old lady. But what he saw next made him freeze. Evan came around the side of the house. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the light from the Jeep cast a halo around his silhouette. This was no ordinary man. This was a combat-trained veteran, with the look of someone who had seen what most people couldn't bear to imagine. A man shaped by loss, survival, and loyalty. And the sight of him standing there, with the gear shift in his hand, his face covered in sweat and dirt, froze the intruder. The man tried to speak, but his voice failed. Evan said nothing. He walked slowly toward him. The wooden floor of the porch creaked beneath his feet, but his body seemed to float. The intruder took a step back, but tripped on one of the loose boards. That was enough. Evan stepped forward, and with a precise blow to the arm, disarmed the man, who was reaching for a short knife. The intruder fell to his knees, groaning. "Get up," Evan said for the first time that night. His voice was low, controlled, but sharp as a cold blade. The man tried to explain himself, stuttering something about just following orders. Evan bent down, looked him in the eye, and spoke clearly. "You almost killed the only good thing I have left in the world. This will not go unnoticed." As he tied her up, he heard the sound of the door slowly unlocking. He turned around, and there she was. Margaret, her hair disheveled, her nightgown stained with dust, and her eyes red but steady. She was still holding the radio, and for a second, she seemed unable to believe he was really there. They stared at each other in silence. Then she gave a slight smile, the kind of smile you only see between people who share a pain that doesn't need to be explained. "You're late, my son, but you're here," she said, almost in a whisper. "I'll never let that happen again, Grandma," he replied, walking towards her. He held her carefully, as if she were made of glass. But inside, he knew. Margaret was made of something harder than stone. Comment here, she was stronger than she looked. Because sometimes, the greatest strength comes from those who everyone thinks no longer have any. And the arrival of the police minutes later would change everything, including the fate of those who doubted. The sound of sirens cut through the morning silence like a delayed accusation. The patrol cars arrived in a line, kicking up dust on the dirt driveway, as if they wanted to make up for the lack of action hours before with noise. The first to get out was the sheriff, his face crumpled, his vest askew, his eyes confused. Still adjusting his belt, he scanned the scene in front of him. 3 men on the ground, their hands tied behind their backs with industrial clamps, their mouths covered with strips of torn fabric. One of them was still struggling, but the fear in his eyes was stronger than any movement. On the other side of the fence, Evan stood with his arms crossed, his face covered in dried sweat and dust. His stubble gave him the appearance of a man who had walked straight off a battlefield, and in a way, he was. Without raising his voice, without making a fuss, Evan simply handed the sheriff his phone and showed him the security camera footage. The images were clear. They showed the 3 of them breaking in, kicking down doors, laughing loudly, breaking windows. The truth was there, raw, filmed in black and white. The sheriff's expression changed. First, embarrassment. Then, something between respect and shame. He cleared his throat, but couldn't say anything. He just shook his head slowly, as if he realized, too late, that he had made a big mistake. Margaret watched everything from the porch, sitting in the rocking chair, with a plaid blanket over her shoulders. A teapot sat beside her, and 2 cups steamed on the small wooden table. The sun was beginning to rise in the sky, and the first rays illuminated her face, revealing marks of fatigue mixed with a firm serenity. When the sheriff approached, trying to formulate some explanation, it was she who spoke first. "You arrived late, but at least you came." The sentence came out sweetly, but its weight was like lead. It was more than a comment. It was a memory. A reminder of how many times that land had been left aside, how many times simple people like her had been left to fend for themselves. The pain was not just in the words, but in what lay behind them. The time, the losses, the feeling of invisibility that only the forgotten know. The sheriff scratched his head in embarrassment and asked in a low tone, "Who taught you to do all this?" Evan looked away from Margaret. He didn't need to answer. The silence between them said more than any sentence could, but it was she who answered, with a small smile and her eyes still full of tears. "He only learned from me not to let them take what is ours." The sheriff nodded. Deputies began to round up the intruders. One of them protested that he didn't know anything, that he was just following orders. Evan didn't move. He just watched. The faces didn't faze him. What mattered now was the face in front of him. The face of the woman who raised him with the same values that had once led him to war. Margaret beckoned him over with a simple gesture. He climbed the porch steps and sat down beside her. He picked up the teacup with still tense hands. The warmth of the drink contrasted with the cold he felt inside. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of it all finally settling on his shoulders. They drank in silence for a few moments, looking out over the field. And then she said, "You got there before they did their worst. That's what matters." But he knew there was something more in that sentence. A weariness. A kind of surrender that is not spoken out loud. Margaret was strong, but she was not made of iron. The dawn had left its mark. Not only on the broken windows, the damaged doors, but inside her. In the space where courage mixes with the weariness of fighting alone for so long. Evan looked at the dirt floor and remembered when he was little. He remembered his grandmother teaching him how to plant, to respect the earth, to listen before speaking. He remembered the day she said that, "There are things we protect, not because they are big, but because they are ours." That stayed with him. It always stayed. Now, sitting beside her, he understood the real meaning of the word. Legacy. It wasn't just the site, the land, or the old house. It was the courage she had passed on to him without making a speech. It was the strength of someone who resists. The mentality of someone who understands that firmness has no age. The sky was beginning to change color, and as much as the tension was still present in the air, there was also a kind of relief. The feeling that despite everything, despite the abandonment, the threat and the fear, they were still there. Together. Firm. Standing. And this was bigger than any invasion. Write it down. It reminded me of someone I respect. Because when stories like this touch us deeply, it's because there's still something inside us that doesn't accept losing what really matters. And what happened next, when the community finally learned the truth, was more unexpected than anyone could have predicted. The morning had barely begun, when the first neighbor appeared at the gate, hat in hand, and eyes downcast. He said nothing at first. He just looked at Margaret, who was slowly digging the soil in the flower bed, as if nothing had happened. But his silence spoke louder than 1,000 words. Soon others arrived, some with homemade bread, others with coffee. One left a bouquet of wildflowers in a makeshift jar. People who had always passed by the dirt road now stopped, looked, listened. People who had never wondered what was hidden behind that tall bush were now whispering her name, as if they were talking about a living legend. Evan, even though he was exhausted, spent the morning fiddling with the cameras. He adjusted the angles, reinforced the cables, and connected everything to a new system that he had programmed himself. He didn't need to say anything. What he did with his hands was just a reflection of what he felt inside. That land would not be violated again. Not by threat, not by greed, not by neglect. In the afternoon, a stamped envelope arrived. It was from the construction company. The language was formal and cold, but the message was clear. In light of recent events and the public repercussions, we hereby inform you that we have definitively withdrawn the proposal to purchase the land. Margaret read the paper calmly. She folded it in half and used it as a bookmark in the book she was reading at night. The countryside seemed greener that day. Maybe it was just an illusion. Maybe it was just the relief after the storm. But there was a different energy there. Margaret picked herbs in the yard with the same delicacy she had used to care for her grandson when he was a child. No rush, no fuss, just presence. Evan watched her from the window. He thought about everything he had experienced in combat zones. Ambushes, bombings, losses that would never be made up for. But there, on that porch that smelled of wood and mint, he realized something he had never learned in the barracks: the power of permanence. What his grandmother did, resisting, day after day, without breaking down, was harder than any mission he had ever faced. That evening, the two of them sat down to dinner. Nothing special: beans, rice, scrambled eggs. But at that table, there was a piece that could not be put into words. Margaret said little. She only said, "Today, I dreamed about your grandfather." Evan looked up in surprise. She continued, slowly stirring the coffee with an old spoon. "He was standing there in the garden." He didn't say anything. He just pointed to the fence. "When I looked, it was surrounded by flowers, and there was a sign with your name hanging on it." Evan didn't answer, but he felt something stir inside his chest. Something between gratitude and heaviness, because he knew what it meant. The fence, which they had tried to tear down, was a symbol of the boundary between the outside world and what was hers. And now he was part of that defense, not just as a grandson, but as a guardian. The next day, children from the local school went on an impromptu field trip to the farm. The teacher, moved by the story, used the episode as a lesson in courage. Margaret offered them lemonade and told them, smiling, that her husband had planted the mango tree in the 1960s. The children listened to her as if she were a book that had taken root, and perhaps she had. Late that afternoon, Evan took a small, aged military pin from his pocket. It was his. But at that moment, it seemed to no longer make sense to him. He handed it to his grandmother and said, his voice breaking, "This is yours. It always has been." She didn't refuse. She picked it up carefully, like someone touching the past. She put it in the pocket of her dress and simply said, "There are things we cannot conquer with weapons, but with determination." The sun began to sink below the horizon. The camera lights turned on by themselves, and the house, for the first time in years, seemed whole. Write it down. She was the foundation. Because in the end, some heroes don't march. They plant, wait, and stand. And that story, which began with a threat, would leave a legacy much greater than the neighbors ever imagined. If you've made it this far, perhaps this story touched you in some way, because it's not just about a farm in the middle of nowhere, but about what each of us holds as non-negotiable, our roots, our memories, what makes us who we are. If this message made sense to you, leave a comment below. There are things we don't sell, so I know you stayed with me until the end. If you liked the way this story was told, leave a like. This shows me that it's worth continuing to bring content that speaks directly to the heart, with truth and soul. And if this type of narrative connects with you, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot of good stuff coming, always with stories that honor those who truly deserve to be remembered. And look, there's a video here that will move you even more. Click and stay with me there, because some stories, when they touch us, don't end. They keep echoing,